please join me in welcoming Miss Beth Baker.
When my mother was 3 years old, her grandfather and aunt were killed when a train hit their car. This was in the early 1920s in rural Ohio. My grandparents had been contentedly raising their family, and just like that, everything changed. They were expected to move into the big farmhouse on the family land and take care of their mother, who had lost her husband in the accident. That's how it's supposed to be, right? Families looking out for their elders from the earliest dawn of time. Well, I don't know about your family, but it wasn't really so hot for my grandmother. She didn't really like her mother-in-law. And my grandfather, his dream had always he always wanted to be an engineer. He didn't really want to be a farmer. But they put their dreams on hold and did their duty and took care of my great-grandmother. But that family story always made me a bit skeptical about the good old days, which we often view with a rosy nostalgia. By the time my grandparents were old themselves, the nursing home had become entrenched across the American landscape. Thousands and thousands of homes where elders were warehoused and isolated until they could make their graceful exit off the planet. My other grandma was one of those elders who died in a nursing home. As I wrote in my earlier book, Grandma Sarah was pretty much a dream grandma. She worked in chocolate, as she put it, either packing chocolates or selling chocolates in Dayton, Ohio. For our birthdays, we would always get a big box of chocolate in the mail. Despite her love for chocolate, Grandma weighed less than 90 pounds. She could play about 100 kinds of poker, and she never grew tired of playing cards with us kids. When Grandma was 92, she became too frail to live on her own, and she moved to a nursing home. Knowing Grandma, she probably didn't want to be a burden on her children. But something happened to her after she moved there. The fun-loving person we had always known seemed to fade away and morph into a generic old person. The last time we saw her, we took our daughter, her namesake, to see her great-grandmother. Our little Sarah was 2 years old. When we entered the nursing home, we saw a long row of women wearing house dresses and sitting in wheelchairs. When they saw our daughter, they leaned over to touch her as she walked solemnly by. Their faces were filled with such longing at the sight of a little child and such hunger for life. Images just like that one have been etched in the public mind for decades. So it's no wonder that over time, a counter-narrative took hold in our culture. We went from, let's take care of our own, to what Bill Thomas has called the John Wayne approach to growing old, going it alone. This is expressed in all sorts of familiar ways. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to impose. I'm not moving. The upshot is we've ended up with tens of millions of older people who think the ideal is to live alone and independent. Woven into this way of thinking is a deep denial. Denial that anything truly awful could happen to us. I've learned that denial is not our friend. Being proactive and intentional about our next chapter puts us in a much better place from which to weather life's challenges. I've spent the last 12 years exploring how pioneering people like you are challenging both our denial and our entrenched and dismal views of aging in this country. My journey began in 2002 when I was on an assignment for the Washington Post. I was working on an article about the health benefits of being around plants and animals and nature. And in the back of my mind, I remembered reading some article about some couple up north who had dreamed up a new kind of nursing home that was filled with plants and pets and children. I thought this might be an interesting angle to pursue, worth a paragraph or two in my story. And somehow I tracked down this Dr. Bill Thomas fellow, not knowing then that it would lead to a whole new path in my writing. I interviewed him, and he told me about how the enriched environment of the Eden Alternative Homes had made such a difference in the lives of people who work and live there. Before we hung up, he said, "You know, there's a much bigger story here you might want to write about, bigger than the pets and plants." He said that around our nation, there were others working to recreate nursing homes and to change the way our culture views aging. These folks, I was later to learn, were coming up with some pretty radical ideas. For one, they, or I should say you, believe that each of us, no matter how old, how sick, how forgetful, how disabled we are, each of us deserves to have a home, not an institution, but a genuine home. Another radical notion these rabble-rousers had was that the lives of people who are very old and frail still matter, that they have meaning, and that disability doesn't define who we are. By the same token, those who are paid to care for our elders also have lives of meaning, and their work should be valued and appreciated by the rest of us. Imagine that. I ended up traveling from Rochester, New York to Seattle, Washington, from Big Fork, Minnesota to Tupelo, Mississippi, and I saw some remarkable places staffed by amazing people. I told this inspiring story of the culture change movement in my last book, Old Age in a New Age. And then I began to notice another intriguing trend. I began running into people like Lynn Moore, a dietitian from Port Gibson, Mississippi. And she told me she and her friends had had a fantasy for years. When they grew older, rather than moving to a traditional retirement community or living alone, they would figure out a way to live together. They would buy a piece of land and build a new kind of building. She pictured it a round building, kind of like a greenhouse in a way, because they would each have their own individual spaces, but then there'd be a common space in the middle where they could hang out together, eat dinner. And then she said as they grew older, if they needed help with cook or cleaning or even personal care, they could hire some help, and together they would share that expense. That would be a way of taking care of each other, she told me, and still have privacy. Well, I can tell you that conversations like this one are happening all across the country as my generation realizes that middle age is rapidly receding in the rearview mirror. And then what? We're asking ourselves, then what? Rather than go straight to denial, many people in my generation, and some who are older, are reimagining how they want to live their next chapter. They're realizing there might be alternatives to moving to a retirement community or moving in with our kids or living alone. People are saying, maybe I can take charge of my future and be intentional and create a way to live that will truly make me happy. So what are people coming up with? It's really remarkable, the variety of options. There's trailer park cooperatives from New Hampshire to Oregon. There's high-rise apartment cooperatives in Minneapolis and New York City. There's co-housing, both multi-generational and senior. There's the village model. There are NORCs, naturally occurring retirement communities. There's something called the Community Without Walls in Princeton, where people have created a big friendship network. There's artist colonies designed for aging actors and writers and painters. There are communities of older gays and lesbians, and retired union postal workers, and Zen Buddhists, and Unitarians. In Texas, there's even a community of aging RV lifers, people who are too frail or sick to hit the road, but who can't give up their Winnebago, their only home, and they've literally circled the wagons and formed a community they describe as assisted living light to support each other. There are best friends deciding to move in together, and total strangers deciding to share a house. And of course, there are still families helping each other out, but in ways sometimes more reciprocal than the way my grandparents had it. What all these models for living have in common is they're rooted in two important values. On the one hand, they allow people to live with autonomy and independence, and on the other, with close relationships and community, what some advocates call interdependence. Interdependence, they suggest, should be our beacon as we grow old, and not independence. The more I delved into these alternatives, the more I began to see ripples of the same themes I found in the culture change movement. Honoring each individual's integrity and worth, the importance of relationships, and of having a sense of purpose and belonging. And you won't be surprised to hear that living with interdependence is actually good for our health, and not just our emotional health. It turns out the John Wayne approach is bad for us. A growing body of research finds that extreme loneliness and isolation can be deadly. Studies have found that loneliness affects our immune system, inflammation levels, blood pressure, stress hormones. At the same time, research is showing strong benefits to having good social connections. In a meta-analysis, they looked at almost 150 studies involving 300,000 people, and the researchers said they were surprised at how strong the influence of social connection was on our mortality, on how long we live. They said it was as strong as the effects of smoking, comparable to smoking and more important than exercise and obesity. So I like to say a good takeaway is as important as jogging or eating kale is having a few good pals. It's why I have trouble with the term aging in place. Aging in place is only as good as the place you're aging in. What if it isolates you? What if it's not safe? What if it marginalizes you instead of holding you close in the heart of a community? So I prefer to think in terms of aging in community. One of the fastest growing models of what I'm talking about is the village model, a Neighbors Helping Neighbors membership organization that's popping up around the country. There's 135 of them now and an equal number being formed in 40-some states. The original village in Boston's prosperous Beacon Hill neighborhood described itself as a concierge service. People could call if they wanted a ride or help walking their dog. I visited one of the biggest villages, which is near me, Capitol Hill Village in DC. While I was there, a member called who wanted a volunteer to come sit at her house while she was expecting a repair person and she needed to be away. And this village had a pool of hundreds of volunteers to call on. But the director then, Gail Cohn, she liked to first call their older members themselves. Why? Because she didn't look at it as a concierge service, but as a community and as a way to create purpose and meaning in people's lives. In short, Capitol Hill Village seeks to address the same plagues that Bill Thomas identified years ago: loneliness, helplessness, and boredom. So when Gail Cohn needed to find a volunteer to house sit, who did she call? She called one of their members who is badly disabled, who can't drive, who could barely walk, and asked him to house sit. He was delighted to. What did that mean? She had to find another volunteer to give this volunteer a ride. But it didn't matter. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about community and creating relationships and having purpose. Sonia Crow, who's the director of another village, told me, part of the beauty of this is that over time, people learn to let go, to trust, to ask, and not feel bad about it. She said, there are pockets of real grace with this village. I'm going to skip ahead and just tell you about a couple others briefly. One model that's growing around the nation is co-housing, which is an intentional community, both multi-generational and senior. And usually these are built from the ground up. And again, it kind of reminds me of a greenhouse. There's a central common area where people can share meals if they like, but rather than each person have her own bedroom and bath, families have apartments or townhouses surrounding these common areas. Ann Zabaldo, who lives in a co-housing community near me, told me why she thinks this model's growing. On a deeper level, across the board, there's a yearning for connectedness, she said. A yearning for connectedness. One of the residents I interviewed at Elder Spirit, which is the first senior co-housing community in the nation, it's in southwestern Virginia, told me why she loved living there. You have neighbors wanting to live in an intentional community, who want to participate in common meals, who have concern for the environment, and an interest in late life spirituality. You can usually find someone to visit with. It's a proactive way to plan for older, more frail years so that a community of friendship can be built for as long as possible. There's one other community I really want to tell you about because it's the most inspiring model I came across. It was founded by a nonprofit called Generations of Hope. It's a community where families adopting children out of the foster care system live alongside elders. The founder, Brenda Ehart, had been working as a social work academic for years, trying to improve the foster care system, and had gotten incredibly frustrated. So she set out to create normalcy for these children and their families. Again, much like you try to create normalcy for elders. Families who move to a Generations of Hope community get all kinds of counseling and support, but perhaps best of all, they live alongside elders who pretty much act as bonus grandparents to these kids. In exchange for reduced rent, the older residents commit to volunteering in the neighborhood, and the bonds that form between these elders and the kids is truly transformative. Just one piece of evidence that shows the success of these communities. Nationally, only 30% of foster kids graduate from high school. But in places like Hope Meadows, 100% of the former foster kids are graduating from high school. What I find so heartening in these examples is that they echo much of what I have heard from culture change leaders around the country and what I know you share. The idea that each person has worth and gifts to contribute. That there's a spirit of creativity within each of us that can be sparked. And most of all, a belief in the transcendent power of relationships and connectedness, of interdependence. I want to quickly address an issue that may be on your minds as I'm talking, and that is, how far can we take these new models, this co-housing and co-ops and villages? Do they really allow people to stay in their homes of choice until the end? I was skeptical as I began writing my book. I was skeptical if they could really prevent, or at least delay, moving to assisted living or a nursing home. I think it's too soon to tell, but there's some developments I find promising, and today I'm just going to tell you about one of them. Again, returning to Capitol Hill Village, it's done more than hardly any of them to support their members as they grow frail. They've created all sorts of great programs. They've partnered with a medical house calls practice so that the docs and nurses come to their frail, homebound elders' homes. They've trained some of their volunteers to be medical advocates who not only sit in during doctor's visits, but they regularly, once a week, check on an elder to see how he or she is doing. And if there's any change at all, they report it to a nurse or social worker to try to stay on top of problems. But of course, even with all kinds of support, at some point, some people can no longer stay in their own homes. So what Capitol Hill Village has proposed to do is to have somebody build a greenhouse smack in the middle of their neighborhood. This would allow people who can no longer stay in their own homes to at least be in a familiar environment and make it easier for their neighbors and friends to visit them. You won't be surprised to hear that there's lots of hurdles to them achieving this dream. They had thought they were partnering with a nonprofit provider, but so far that hasn't worked out. But folks, this is not rocket science. What I would love to see are partnerships forming between the greenhouse and culture change movements on the one hand, and those working to age in their communities, like the Village to Village Network. Why can't we achieve this? This is what people want. Why does it have to be so hard? More than financing or regulations, I believe it's a matter of will. We somehow need to find the time and energy in our busy lives to organize across the broadest spectrum of people wanting to change the culture of aging in this country and make this happen. We have to be creative, and I'm optimistic that the coming generation of elders is going to find new and unexpected ways to foster interdependence for all of us. No matter how people choose to live, I believe the recurring themes will be autonomy, mutual support, and having meaning and purpose. This is what makes for a good old age. We need connections until we take our last breath. Whether we find those connections in our neighborhoods, with our friends and family, in our congregations, or in our greenhouses, we need them just as much as when we're old as any other age, or perhaps especially when we're very old. As I write at the end of my book, aging in community doesn't begin when we turn a particular age, be it 60 or 80. It begins right now, whatever our age. Forming relationships, lending a hand, sharing a laugh, knowing you're there for each other. It matters not what form or structure our communities take. The point is to have a community, a circle of caring, who will be there for the long haul as best they can as we live our final chapter. Thanks so much for having me.